I have a friend who, when asked a question, "How are you doing?" usually responds, "Compared to what?" In other words, if I compare myself to the refugee family in Syria displaced from their own homeland, I'm doing pretty well. If I compare myself to the person with a greater peace of mind and a greater attitude about life, then I'm not doing that well. It's a standard greeting that we offer to one another. How are you? How have you been? And normal response, of course, is I'm doing well, I'm doing fine. But how are we really doing perhaps requires a larger response. On any given day, one can think, today actually didn't go that well. My spouse and I had a disagreement before we went to work. I've had some adolescent issues with one of my children. Things at work today went the opposite direction I had hoped they'd go. I didn't do very well on the test. My relationship is on the edge of breaking up. The job didn't come through. The job offer didn't come through. The medical test came back positive, and I have a lot of aches and pains today that continue to persist. But even though these issues seem significant in our own context, when we compare them to issues that other people have, they may pale in comparison, especially when we read about the pain and suffering all around this nation and all around the world. Just last week, we saw a man at one of the intersections of Highway 36, just north of Boulder, Colorado, with a sign that read, "Homeless and hungry, please help." We see those same signs right here in Manhattan. Yesterday afternoon while at the office, I received a call from a 60-year-old man who said he was Jewish and he was looking for a Jewish congregation in Manhattan. I gave him the number of the Manhattan Jewish congregation on Reith Avenue, and then he shared with me that he was in Manhattan and that he was homeless. So I called the Super 8 Motel, where the church has an account. I put him up overnight, and then I called the Denny's restaurant right next door and said, could I buy his meal over the phone with a credit card and so on? And the very kind woman said, "No, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it." All of a sudden, my issues or my problems that I think I might have were reduced to the reflection on the comparison between them and me. No shelter, no food, no transportation for them compared to me with a car that would later take me home to a comfortable house and a good meal. Comparisons like these should help us appreciate the advantages and the comforts that we easily take for granted, but they don't always register or sink in as much as they should. That's why we need constant scriptural reminders of our role and of our responsibility in taking care of the least of these, as Jesus said. Comparisons in this context are good and productive because they energize us into doing what we might not do otherwise. It's hard to escape comparisons, isn't it? Measuring ourselves against someone else's condition is generally unavoidable. We hear the word incomparable, for instance, when referring to a superstar team or a superstar athlete. But we all know that teams fall from grace and that superstars lose their physical abilities, they diminish. Kentucky was considered incomparable and invincible by many until they lost to Wisconsin. Comparisons can be both positive and negative depending on the nature of the comparison, as we know. And so it is that we take the things considered incomparable and we look at faith in life. The takeaway from the Isaiah passage read so well for us by Robin this morning, for me at least, is the unfathomable notion of anybody ever trying to make a comparison between themselves and God, anything that exists in God. "Who is my equal?" says the Holy One in the passage. "Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? Who has brought out one starry host after another? Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of those starry hosts is missing." God makes it very clear in the Isaiah passages that there is no room for any consideration of paralleling him to anybody else, which begs the question of the quality of our own comparisons. Since God is beyond comparison, and since he has ultimate authority in our lives, then to whom do we compare ourselves? But we know that since God has come to us in the flesh, in the form of Jesus Christ, a man who walked the face of the earth and who laughed and suffered just as we do every day and every week, we have a person now to whom we can compare ourselves, don't we? When my brothers and I were growing up, although it was never said directly to us, but always implied, my parents sent all kinds of signals for us to not compare ourselves with others, but compare yourself to Christ. And when you do that, then ask yourself the question, how do you measure up? They always knowing the obvious answer, we didn't measure up very well. For that matter, very few people, as we know, measure up very well when compared to Christ. Their parental lesson was all about humility. But the tendency and the inclination for many of us is to consider their value in the comparisons that they make with others. We're all the time forgetting the most important comparison that we are able to make, and that is with Jesus Christ. Recent research at the University of Houston indicates that liking other people's status and updates on their Facebook could make you like yourself less. It could even cause a little depression, so says the research. According to the research, most of Facebook friends tend to post about all the good things that occur in their lives while leaving out the bad. And so said the report, if we're comparing ourselves to our friends' highlight reels, this may lead us to think that they are better than they actually are, and conversely, make us feel worse about our own lives. You see the danger in comparisons. The lesson of all this, don't let your value depend on comparing yourself to someone else. The business of comparisons is risky business, considering the unlimited ceiling heights of comparisons. When is one ever satisfied? When is one ever content? You can compare yourselves, of course, to other people's careers. You can compare your house to another person's house. You can compare your car to another person's car. You can compare your investments. You can compare your kids to other people's kids. You can compare your kitchen countertops. You can compare your kitchen appliances. You can compare your income. You can compare your research. You can compare even your own yard to your next door neighbor's yard. You can compare the friendliness of your dog to the friendliness of another dog. You can compare almost anything, can't you? But is there ever an end? It's kind of like chasing the rabbit around the barn. Paul in 2 Corinthians was even more adamant. We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. I remember as a kid growing up, I used to spend a lot of time at a friend's house who seemed to have everything. His dad owned and operated one of the bigger steel mills in town. He had a mega-sized house, at least it was from a child's perspective. You know, when you returned to home, sometimes the house wasn't as big as you actually thought it was. There was a big swimming pool in back. There was a huge basketball court with a big playing surface. And get this, my friend had a baseball diamond in his backyard where we used to play ball all day long until the sun went down. Often when I go home after a day at Tommy's house, the Presbyterian in Mance, I look at my houses, which is a very nice home, but it had a very small backyard. It had a one of those fences around it, chain link fences around it to keep the dog from getting out. Had a small basketball backboard attached to the garage and a very small playing surface and a very narrow alley running behind the house. I'd imagine what it would be like if I had Tommy's house with my own baseball diamond and a big swimming pool. I was comparing, you see, all I had to what he had, recognizing all along there was no material comparison in this one. But later I realized that I was comparing the wrong things. Now when I reflect back to the joy and the laughter, the love that was in my house, that was much more valuable than the swimming pools and the ball diamonds and the basketball courts although there may have been the same kind of joy in my friend's house, although I never knew. But what remains intact in my mind is a feeling of family and a feeling of friends going in and out the door. Nothing else compared. And so we understand that life is not intended to be an infinite matching up with others, but instead a matching up with the permanent ideals of love and truth. With the number one matchup, the standard set for us by our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And then comparison to the ones who we think practice those same standards of Jesus Christ. This is the measuring stick by which we start. Our New Testament lesson this morning again finds the Apostle Paul telling the church at Corinth that they should be aware of comparing themselves with the wrong ideas, looking up to values that really run counter to Christ's values. You know, in every field of life, there are those to whom we look up. There are measuring sticks, as we know, for our own advancement in our chosen vocations and professions and role models, if you please. If it could be in the fields of music, it could be in the fields of accounting and engineering, architecture, medicine, athletics, dentistry, ministry, law, farming, teaching, any profession or occupation. When you compare someone who is at the top of his or her field and they are there for good reasons, you realize that you have a long way to go, which in turn motivates you to do better, doesn't it? The same for the Christian way in life. I know I have personally admired and I have looked up to particular characteristics that others have in the Christian way in life that I need some work on. It could be one of the fruits of the Spirit that Paul talked about in Galatians. It could be peace. It could be forbearance. It could be kindness. It could be faithfulness. It could be gentleness. It could be self-control. And I would add to that list that could be generosity. It could be attitude. It could be tolerance. It could be sharing. It could be listening. I have seen how good some of these virtues are in others, and I realize how much further I have to go. These are good comparisons again, because they motivate us to become better people and therefore become closer to God. The message then is compare yourself to Christ. Try to become like him, and good things will happen. You know, even Napoleon realized the ultimate comparison when he said, I know men, and I tell you, Jesus Christ is no mere man. Between him and every other person in the world, there is no possible term of comparison. Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and I have founded empires. But on what did we base the creation of our genius? It was sheer force. Jesus Christ founded his empire based on love. And at this hour, millions would die for him. Last week, the college from which I graduated hosted the 2006 Nobel Prize winner in physics, astrophysicist John Mather, who delivered a lecture to the college community. I wasn't there, but I read a summary of his presentation. And he was talking about what we can expect from the universe in the next billion years. A really light subject, you know. And he talked about what we need to do relative to energy and to pollution and to medicine, among other things, to sustain future generations and to sustain our universe. He said to the college community to not be discouraged because you don't have all the answers. Keep working on it and have courage. But in the context of this lecture on the incredible scope and the infinite nature of the universe and the enormous complexities of it all beyond our wildest imaginations, one of the students reduced it down to a very simple question. He asked, what is our purpose for being here anyway? The Nobel Prize winning astrophysicist said, look inside your heart. That may be where your purpose comes from. And you get to choose. Look inside your heart. That's where your purpose may come from. And you are allowed to choose. When we search our hearts and we make the choice to follow Christ, and then when we follow Christ and we compare ourselves to him rather than to others, then we will live life with purpose and we will have purposeful lives. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable unto you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen.